が始まるんですよ。先にこっちの様子見に入ってるよね。
なんかちょっと上げると緩い。
Hi. So you can start. Okay. So 2 minutes to go. So this is a room Panel2 translation in education. The first speaker is Duncan Lee. So he is an assistant professor in English, applied English at the University of Warwick. His research and teaching combine drama pedagogy and intercultural language education. So 25 minutes we have maybe 20 minutes presentation and 5 minutes question.
Right, hello. Thank you very much for joining us here. Before I begin, I'd just like to say thank you very much to the organisers. Conference organisation is challenging at the best of times, but they've done an absolutely fantastic job. I'd also like to say thank you very much to Hide-san and Nori, who's raced back here from Germany to be with myself and Deco. So it's really nice to have an opportunity to talk about translation in Shakespeare education. I know Professor Honsla's mentioned there about translation studies as being kind of or Shakespeare translation as the Cinderella of Shakespeare studies. I must admit, sometimes I feel like that with Shakespeare education. We're often kind of in a tiny room tucked away while the other work is going on elsewhere. So it's really nice to have this focus at this conference on Shakespeare and education. So my presentation today is called Intercultural Mediation, Identity and Internet Poems, Translating Shakespeare at a Chinese University. So what I'd like to begin with is a very, very common question that we hear quite a lot in Shakespeare studies and also in popular discourse about Shakespeare. Why Shakespeare? Which sometimes means, why still Shakespeare? Why Shakespeare again? Why Shakespeare at all? And I'm going to do it with a slight variation, which is, why use Shakespeare in the language classroom? Why use it in language education? Because many people do it, but many people will tell you that it can't or it shouldn't be done. Because certainly the dominant modes of language education today really emphasize instrumental goals of communicative efficiency and employability. So language education is very often supposed to be practical, it's supposed to be useful in a very, very narrow sense. And obviously those of us who are here who don't speak Japanese know that it is very useful to be able to ask, where is the bathroom? Where is the train station? Why isn't my ticket working? And things like this. But as we'll see, of course, there are other things that we need to do and want to do with language. But if we're taking this very kind of instrumental, narrowly practical perspective, then Shakespeare can seem very impractical, it can seem out of date, it can seem weird, it can seem strange. Although, as I've argued elsewhere, is it necessarily such a bad thing for anything to be strange? Especially if we think about the early modern senses of that word strange as well as the modern. Another issue with Shakespeare is that even though it's technically English, many of my Chinese students would say it's Old English. And I would have to say, well, it's not technically Old English, it's early modern English, but obviously it's experienced often as being foreign, as Paul LeBlanc has mentioned. And this can mean it can actually be a real source of anxiety and confusion for students, especially as Ruben Espinosa has pointed out, for students whose cultural and linguistic backgrounds mean that they already have maybe a very complex relationship with English. This can be quite a threatening thing in terms of their identity, their sense of belonging, if they're told, well, this is English and you don't really understand it. One of my participants in the study I'm going to talk about today actually called Shakespeare a foreign language in foreign language for him as a Chinese student of literature. However, I should point out that he said this in the context of saying how much he enjoyed doing Shakespeare and how much he enjoyed the challenge. So what I'd like to propose is that despite those reservations, there are actually some reasons why it's not completely bonkers to use Shakespeare in the language classroom, and especially, I would argue, in the intercultural language classroom. So for a start, as Guy Cook has mentioned and Joe Winston has taken up, play is central to how we actually use and learn languages. Cook contends that language teaching materials very often focus on those narrowly instrumental, useful exchanges at the supermarket, at the bank. Again, very, very important, very useful for our everyday lives. But of course, we're here at a conference relating to Shakespeare. We know that language can do other things, that we want to do other things with language. So Cook argues that if language teaching materials are going to encompass the other things that we do with language, then they need to change. They need more nonsense, fiction and ritual, and many more instances of language use for aggression, for intimacy, and for creative thought. And of course, we can find all of those things in abundance in Shakespeare, I would argue. Another useful thing about fictional texts, whether Shakespeare or anything else, is that they can help students to negotiate the defamiliarization that can happen in intercultural encounters, because of course they're not only trying to make sense of another unfamiliar language, another unfamiliar culture, but also that intercultural experience hopefully will make them reevaluate things about their own languages and culture, maybe question some of those assumptions. And so Pulvinist, taking the Russian, I apologize if there's any Russian speakers in the room, taking the Russian formalist notion of ostroleniying, this kind of defamiliarization, he argues that you can take science fiction texts about immigration experiences and use those, but I would also argue that the kind of strangeness of Shakespeare makes it also a very good way to defamiliarize English and help students kind of negotiate that intercultural experience. So one of the main things I'm going to be talking about this afternoon is intercultural mediation. And particularly I'm drawing on Lidico and Scarino's intercultural perspective on language teaching and learning. And what they argue is that learners are not simply passive recipients of linguistic and cultural facts. This is the word for this. In this country, you do this. When you greet someone, you bow or you shake hands or whatever. They point out that learners are active, self-aware participants in processes of meaning-making and intercultural mediation. So on this note, they say that intercultural language users mediate between languages and cultures as an inherent part of communication. In many ways, intercultural communication is just communication. We're always involved in this process of mediating. And so as a result, in my teaching and my research, I try and place an emphasis on doing. What are people actually doing with and through language? Whether they're languaging, translanguaging, or doing something with Shakespeare. And so this focus on doing leads me to the particular perspective that I employ in my work. Nori mentioned earlier, I'm in a department of applied linguistics, so I'm the weird Shakespeare person in an applied linguistics department, and here I guess I'm the weird applied linguist at Shakespeare conference, but anyway, it can be quite nice sometimes being the freak in the room. But to just explain this perspective, so ethnomethodology, as the parts of its name suggest, is the study of people's methods. Specifically, it's the study of the methods that people use to make sense of the world around them, but also to make sense in the world around them. So rather than trying to use kind of sociological concepts that people themselves won't understand or won't recognise in reference to their own behaviour, ethnomethodology aims to recast humans as sense makers or interpreters of the world, rather than as vehicles for the operation of generalised norms. In other words, in Harold Garfinkel's words, as cultural dopes, walking around completely unaware of their actions as if they've just been programmed by the culture they live in. So in this view, social order is something that's done by people, not something that's simply done to them. And so from a research perspective, this involves moving beyond assumptions about what we or others are thinking or intending to instead focus on what is actually analytically observable. So this is done, and I'll try and go through this quickly because I'm aware this is my weird applied linguistics bit that's probably slightly beyond the scope of the conference. So two of the particular tools that we use as ethnomethodologists, conversation analysis, or CA, and then membership categorization analysis, or MCA. So conversation analysis, it really pays very, very close attention to how talk works, what is done through conversation. The way that conversation, rather than being a mess, as someone like Chomsky would have had it, is actually, very, very carefully, intricately designed, and that design leads it to people to be able to do things through conversation, the way that it's sequentially arranged, and we'll see an example of that in a moment. Membership categorization analysis is to do with categories. It thinks about how people use categories to make sense of the world, but also to make sense to other people about how they're understanding things. When we invoke a category, for instance, British, Japanese, Chinese, we then use that category to do certain things. We explain behavior. For example, I can see my friend Tara at the back there, we were talking yesterday about the fact that we were possibly getting away with inadvertently rude behavior because people could see that we were visibly foreign. And so excuses were made for the fact that we're gaijin, we don't know what we're doing. So I'm going to give you an example here of the kind of thing that we do with CA and MCA.
I think Shakespeare is please do not be offended. I think Shakespeare is just one kind of drama. It's just one kind of drama, and there are many other kinds of drama in the world.
So what we have here is a student working extremely hard not to offend me by saying that Shakespeare is just one kind of drama. Now, of course, I agree. Absolutely. But what we see here is, obviously, we've got the very explicit, please do not be offended. So she's framing what she's saying as something that's face-threatening, potentially face-threatening for me as a supposed Shakespeare expert, and I use that term advisedly, but also potentially face-threatening for her as someone who's saying to the supposed Shakespeare expert, actually, he's not that special. He's not exceptional. Now, I completely agree in many ways with this student, but what I draw your attention to is the way that she's not just positioning me, but working so hard not to offend by the way that she designs this. So, for instance, we have all these hesitations. These are not mistakes. They're not fillers that we need to get rid of. We've got all of these pauses here where she's slowing it down, kind of minimizing what she's saying. She's stretching, which again slows it down, makes it a bit more hesitant. We've got here this dot PT in the grey. She does a lip smack. And all of this is important. And she also uses what's you may know as vocal fry, or in technical CA terms, really, we use the term creaky voice. As she kind of makes it very quiet, like this, as she kind of makes it quieter as she's saying this potentially very face-threatening thing. Now, of course, I completely agree with her. It is just one kind of drama in the world, but what you can see here is the way she's kind of addressing Shakespeare's status. So to get specifically onto what I would use this for with education, things like lessons, tasks, engagement, are students paying attention? Even learning, teachers, students, they're not simply there. as educational facts. These are locally, practically accomplished. You know, how do we know who's it? Well, a presenter, for example, I'm standing at the front of the room with a microphone. So if I'm not the presenter, then I'm being extremely cheeky with what I'm doing now. I'm taking a real liberty. But just the whole way that the room is set up, the way that a classroom is set up, you know, it helps us to communicate these things, to locally, practically accomplish them. And of course, we can think about this with various cultural, linguistic identities and also with Shakespeare. So what I did was applied this to a series of 14 practical Shakespeare workshops at a Chinese university. So the participating students were undergraduates, some postgraduates who were mostly from the English faculty. And just to explain, as a foreign studies university in China, the students here had, apart from the fact they were studying English as English majors, they also did a second foreign language. So many of them were studying French or Japanese or Vietnamese or Korean, but also many of them also spoke other languages at home as well. So apart from Mandarin, quite a few of them also spoke Cantonese or Hakka or other Chinese languages. Me as the practitioner researcher was far less multilingual. It's kind of okay Mandarin, quite basic but sometimes quite sweary Cantonese, which I learned in football stadiums in the city I was living in, and then hopefully passable English, although after jet lag, maybe not so much. So what I tried to do was look at all of the data I could get, recordings of the workshops and interviews, written reflections, my research journal, the materials that the students produced or that we used in the classroom. And specifically with regards to translation, here's an example of one of the workshops that we did. So I called it, Shall I Compare Thee to a What? And so we were thinking about, you know, comparison, that old hoary subject of equivalence, but trying to do that through a way of intercultural mediation. So we began with a video of Tom Hiddleston reading Sonnet 18, which went down extremely well with the students, although I urge you to view this. If you look on YouTube, it's for something, an advert for something called the Love Book app. And I personally find this absolutely excruciatingly embarrassing, this particular reading. So I really, it's, you know, one of the few times I can get one up on Tom Hiddleston in my life. So I advise you to watch that and cringe along with me later. But after this got us on to talking about how should you read a Shakespeare sonnet? Do you read it in your voice or do you read it in Shakespeare voice? And this was something we had to kind of negotiate, but it also got onto students' expectations of this poem, which is so famous. Well, what actually is it? So next we had a sonnet battle where the students, I divided them in two and said, okay, some of them had said it's a romantic poem. So we said, okay, this half of the room, you have to prove that it's a romantic poem. This half of the room, you need to prove that it's a very unromantic poem. So they then did these two competing close readings. Finally, we reviewed and commented on 4 Mandarin translations of Sonnet 18. After the workshop, the students then found or even produced their own translations of various sonnets or extracts of Shakespeare in different languages. So we had Cantonese, we had Japanese, we also had Vietnamese. And certainly the latter 2 of those languages I speak none of at all. So coming on to the next part of my title, Internet poems. So we've already seen someone suggesting that Shakespeare is just one kind of drama in the world, but here we see maybe the other side of that coin, the idea that Shakespeare, there is something exceptional about Shakespeare. And this is important because this relates to students' reactions to and responses to using translation as intercultural mediation. As a kind of good intercultural educator, you know, I talk about things like agency and empowering students and using their own cultural resources. Not all of the students wanted to do this. So we see this particular student here basically complaining about the fact that in the workshop we were doing too much about what he called Chinese Shakespeare. And I was saying, well, you know, is that a problem? And he was saying, well, I want to do the original Shakespeare, not the Chinese Shakespeare. I said, well, don't you think the Chinese version is Shakespeare? He says, well, it's the Chinese Shakespeare, not the British Shakespeare. And this makes more sense as he continues when he says, well, I tried to push back on this and say, well, do you think my Shakespeare is the Shakespeare of 400 years ago? Is there only one British Shakespeare? And he says, well, no, but you'll help us to understand the 400 years ago Shakespeare. So clearly positioning me as the British person in the room, that was my role there, to introduce the kind of authentic British Shakespeare. Now again, this is something that I often push back on, but it was a very, very common conversation I had with the students. And I'll just play you the next bit of this where he talks about internet poems. That's interesting that you want to get to kind of the original.
Yes, yeah. Because when we look at the Chinese translation of the Sonnet 18, if we just erase the title, erase the author, I think for me it's like a internet poem.
Okay.
Yeah.
And after this, he elaborated by saying, well, it's not special. It's missing this kind of special ingredient which somehow Shakespeare in the original English gives it. So what I would describe as kind of Shakespearean essentialism, the idea that there is this essence that is lost in translation. And obviously that idea of being lost in translation is a very, very common kind of cliched thing. But this is important when we think about how students engage with Shakespeare in translation, what they feel that they're doing, how they feel that their wishes are being respected. The next clip I'm going to play you is showing that, as I said, I try and be a good intercultural educator, but we all make mistakes, and here is an example of this.
Did you read any Shakespeare before or seen any?
No.
Even
I read Romeo and Juliet in Chinese.
So you had?
Yeah, but in Chinese.
Guilty as charged. So here I'm talking to a student who I was very surprised that she claimed that she'd never done any Shakespeare before she came to a workshop with me, and I just couldn't believe that was true from what all the other students had told me. I say, had you done it even in Chinese? As if, it doesn't really count, but and then I say at the end, so you had, but you'd done it in Chinese, and she agrees, yeah, but in Chinese. So, when I was going through this, I kind of, why did I do it? But these kind of ideologies, language ideologies, and also Shakespearean ideologies, they're very, very pernicious. And one of the arguments that I would make is that this kind of analysis of your own teaching for teachers can be absolutely terrifying, very upsetting, but very, very important to see what we're actually doing. So, internet poems, a lot of the students had this idea of they wanted the authentic Shakespeare, which was Shakespeare in English. Often it was Shakespeare in period productions, kind of doublet and hose. Often it was Shakespeare in a received pronunciation, Southern English accent. And all of these things I tried to push back on. It's sometimes quite difficult if a student has spent years trying to speak like Benedict Cumberbatch and speaks far more like Benedict Cumberbatch than I certainly do, especially if I've had a couple of beers and I'm going properly Essex, again, which is where I grew up. So it's quite important to think about how these kind of language ideologies also link up to identity. So anyone in here who doesn't read Chinese, could you hazard a guess at, we've got 4 versions of the same thing, the opening 2 lines of something here. Anyone like to have a guess? I can see, yep.
I think it's Sonnet 8, because I do read Japanese and I can see the character for summer.
Yeah, very good, yeah. So at the top, in the first one, it does use summer, and I'm very glad you mentioned summer. Yeah. So Xiaotian in Mandarin, because this is one of the things that came up as the students started to discuss it. So yeah, you're absolutely right. We've got 4 translations here of Sonnet 18. Obviously the students looked at the whole thing. They compared them in various ways and discussed them. And what was really interesting that came up is that some of the terms that were used not just for summer, but also for the idea that the person the poem is directed to is temperate, is gentle, various things like this, then became linked to ideas of gender. So the particular student who was picking this out, who incidentally described her obsession with translation as the disease of a literature student, which I thought was quite a nice way of putting it, this kind of obsessive compulsion that she has. But she was saying about, the first one, she argued, was kind of over-translated slightly, the first highlighted one there, Qinhui. It's kind of like bright, a very literary way of saying something's bright and summery and stuff like this. Those of you who've been to the UK know that an English summer is not always those things. And she was complaining about it being kind of over-translated over the far more literal Xiaotian or summer, which you were able to identify from its similarity with the kanji for that. So she then went on to talk about this in relation to gender, the way that the description of summer, these students, most of whom had never been to the UK, but were very, had this idea of what the English summer was supposed to be like in a literary sense, which was not the same as my experience of the English summer in a literal sense. She was talking about how this then linked to the way that the different versions of Sonnet 18 depicted gender. And I think in all four, if I remember correctly, it's very much this is addressed to a female subject, whereas of course Sonnet 18, we know that's not necessarily the case. And one of the words which really came up, not just in this workshop or this poem, but throughout the course, was fair, as being one that we really talked about a lot. I also did the Fletcher play, The Island Princess, with them, which is an absolutely fascinating play, and especially a fascinating play to do in Asia in a kind of intercultural setting. And this gendered, raced discussion that we had around fair was very, very interesting, and certainly was not abstract, because the students that I was teaching here, the department, the faculty was very, very, the vast majority of staff and students are female, even though the top management at the university is overwhelmingly male. So there's a big mismatch there. And the students were kind of very, very well aware of their discussions of kind of Chinese literary depictions of femininity, Shakespearean depictions of femininity, and the kind of shifting gender roles in China and how this related to their own kind of position in the world. And also, when they were talking about translation, doing translation, it ended up, sometimes making them really reconsider certain things about national, cultural, or other linguistic identities. So it's sometimes said that one of my colleagues at Warwick, Tony Lidicote, wrote a thing about a Jersey French dictionary. When the first Jersey French dictionary was produced, it, on the one hand, said, here is a language. But on the other hand, it made the people who spoke Jersey French feel that they didn't know their own language properly, because there were many terms in this dictionary that they didn't know. And what we saw in the workshops was something similar, where you might think that the Chinese versions of the poems were helping students to understand the English, but in some cases students found the English versions easier. So one of the students mentioned this term, this very archaic term, dieshie, which was used in the line about, nor shall death break thou wandest in his shade. She was completely unfamiliar with this, had to look it up, and was kind of like, really almost felt quite disturbed about her own knowledge of her own language because she wasn't aware of this term. We also had several students who, despite the fact they were Cantonese speakers, despite the fact that they were translation and interpreting majors, this workshop was the first time they'd ever translated anything into their own first language, because the program that they're on is very much, if you're doing it into or from Chinese, that means into or from Mandarin. So they had some very interesting things to say about that. And I'll give you one final quote from a student, which I hope will also show how the experience of translation or doing Shakespeare relates to the way that they kind of position themselves, their own identity.
So I'm wondering, I want to figure out why they like him, and so trying to say, can I love you? Because people usually say an English major student should like Shakespeare because they like bury themselves in Shakespeare's ocean.
So obviously we were laughing as she was using this expression about English majors should bury themselves in Shakespeare's ocean, this kind of act of devotion almost, and being subsumed by Shakespeare. But throughout the conversation we were having here, which goes on for much longer, it was clear that the fact that she didn't like Shakespeare, certainly not when before the workshop started, was leading her to question, well, am I a proper student of English literature? Because if, and this is going back to membership categorization analysis, if English majors love Shakespeare and I don't love Shakespeare, am I a proper English major? And again, this wasn't an abstract thing for her. This was something that she actually felt quite keenly, despite the kind of laughter. So hopefully what I've shown in this talk is that students' intercultural mediation through translation was closely related to their ongoing construction and negotiation of identities as students of literature and multilingual intercultural individuals. I don't need the Chinese translation because my English is good enough. And if you're forcing the Chinese translation on me, are you kind of insulting me in a way? So hopefully I've also shown that an emphasis on translation as intercultural mediation is a very powerful tool in the Shakespeare classroom, but also I would argue Shakespeare is a very powerful tool in the intercultural classroom as well. However, it is very important to be aware of the ongoing need to avoid native speakerism and deficit frameworks. So positioning students as imperfect speakers of English, for example, positioning Chinese students as inherently knowing less about Shakespeare than me. You know, at the end of the workshops, I shared with them the fact that I didn't enjoy Shakespeare at school at all. When I was a literature student, I avoided Shakespeare as much as I could. And it was only in later life that it made more sense, as so many things, only made sense to me. And so hopefully this has given you an idea about how I try and use translation as intercultural mediation. And I look forward to any questions later. So if you'd like references or if you have any questions, please do feel free to email. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Don. Maybe one or two questions.
Well, so such an interesting talk. Thank you so much. I suppose, and this is a slightly devil's advocate question, but wouldn't you have had similar discussions if you'd done Harry Potter? I mean, did it have to be Shakespeare? Or?
It certainly didn't have to be Shakespeare. What do you mean in the sense of if we'd done?
Well, you could have compared translations and had discussions about cultural meaning and native speakerism and things. So, I mean, I'm a Shakespearean, so I love that it was Shakespeare. But I was wondering, in terms of the discoveries they were making, whether the Shakespeare-ness was simply a vehicle, or whether in some sense it was about Shakespeare.
A bit of both, I would say, which is my way of hedging. In many ways, I mean, part of it was a strategic decision. If I'd gone into the university and said I'd like to do a course on Harry Potter, or especially if I'd gone in and said I want to do a series of workshops on something possibly a bit more provocative, especially with regards to gender, race, things like that, it would have been far more likely that they said no. So Shakespeare, because he's perceived as safe, is a really good way of getting in the door. But the other thing that's really, and actually you could use Harry Potter for precisely this reason, because everyone knows something about Shakespeare, even if actually they've never read any Shakespeare and they've just always been told he's this great kind of impenetrable figure or whatever. And so kind of harnessing those assumptions, again, I found a really interesting way of tackling some of these assumptions about whether it's British culture or kind of intercultural communication, because very quickly the students realised that when they've usually been doing cross-cultural study, so here is British culture, Shakespeare is an example of that, here is Chinese culture, Tang Shenzhou, is an example of that. Actually what they saw is, Tang Shenzhou's China is not their China, Shakespeare's Britain is not their Britain, and then you would push it to say, well actually, was Tung Shenzu's China ever China, and was Shakespeare's Britain ever Britain? So hopefully that answers the...
That absolutely does. Can I just very briefly ask, you had all kinds of symbols when you were transliterating things. What does the pound sign mean?
That's the laughter. So I deliberately tried not to try and go through them, but yeah, when you've got the pound signs, that's kind of laughter. The hashtag sign is creaky voice, vocal fry. So this is a whole other kind of language that we use in conversation analysis, which is, again, is as impenetrable as Shakespeare. Sometimes people claim he is, sometimes bigger.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was a fascinating talk. Because I really, your lecture reminded me. When I started teaching in this university, I was teaching to law school students upper level English, and then I started using some materials like Evening War and that sort of thing. And then, so that as far as you started talking about this, using Shakespeare in language class and the language educations, and then the second half, you are talking about, many students here are talking about this come from the English department, English lit, and so on. So can you sort of really combine this those two? It's particularly that you can use in the Shakespeare in the language as the language class or the communicative English class and so on. What this sort of use Shakespeare has.
Yeah, thank you very much for the question. I mean, if we're thinking in terms of communicative language teaching, some of the things that we can do with Shakespeare, obviously around things like stress, the importance of stress in Shakespeare, and if you're coming from a language which doesn't use tonal stress in the same way as English does and Chinese doesn't, Shakespeare can actually be a really good way of, because as Cook argues, language textbooks never talk about how do you be angry in a foreign language. Sometimes you might need to be. If someone has really overstepped the line or you need to defend yourself, you might need to be angry in a foreign language. And fiction, whether it's Shakespeare, whether it's movies or whatever, does give you that opportunity. But I think I would also argue that we need to kind of move away from, communicative language teaching absolutely has its place, it's extremely important. But when you get to university level, and some of the students that I was teaching, they're kind of very, very much sort of beyond some of those things. They want to do other things that inspire them, that move them, that are creative in that language. And engaging with Shakespeare, I think, is one way to do that. So, it's not going to teach you what you should say if you want to go to the bank and say, why can't I get any money out? But it may teach you something about life and all its mysteries. Or should we move on to?
Yes.
Very good question. I might have missed it, but I know you just finished your thesis, and are we going to be able to read it in any form? Because it sounds amazing.
Thank you. Hopefully, yes. Watch this space. Yes. If you have any contacts that you'd like to put me in touch with, then yeah. But hopefully, yes.
Thank you very much. There will be a tour, Tsubochi Memorial Theatre Museum tour 4:10, but to be fair for him, I will keep going until 4:10. So. So he is a lecturer with Department of English and French, Umaru Mua Seldua University, Nigeria since 2013.
Thank you so very much. And I told Prof. Duncan that I like the way our papers are put together because we are taking kind of different directions. So this is the title of my paper, and I have some outline here. I will talk briefly introduction and then the scope, which I may have to skip for. Maybe if we have time, we'll talk about that. And then I am arguing about moving on from translating into just a way of comparison. So I am proposing a comparative method as kind of experiment. And then I will look at Shakespeare and Ahmed Rima. Ahmed Rima is one of the writers that we could use, or the dramatists or playwrights that we can use to study Shakespeare together. And then finally, I go to conclusion where I talk about the potential of the method that I am proposing. So now, here I want to talk about the background of the research. And here, teaching of literature in northern Nigeria. Actually, it is still more or less colonial, because from your students who major in English, it is also the same. People who major in English are expected to also bury themselves in the Shakespeare's ocean. So people like to think along that line, like, am I really a major in Shakespeare and in English, because I need to know this. So it's highly colonial. Even some of the lectures will tell you that we don't need this text produced here locally. We need to study text written by people who have English as first language. So, and drama is not something new to the region, because there are many texts in drama in Hausa that are popular there, but then we don't imagine them being compared to Shakespeare. And then a reception of Shakespeare, just like you said, in most of these cultures is really complex. People feel a bit intimidated by the language. You have to really convince them that Shakespeare is not as difficult as you think. So students, and part of the requirement is that you have to study a course called Shakespearean Studies. That's the title of the course. One has to pass that course to graduate. So it is always intimidating for students. And then now I want to argue that if we translate, because there are translations of Shakespeare, if you go and read translation, are you really reading Shakespeare, the essentialism we talked about? And then if you study Shakespeare alone, what does that say about our effort to decolonize even this English studies itself? So here are some of the examples of the translations that were made from Hausa. For example, Julius Caesar is translated as Jeremiah Caesar, Macbeth as Makau, Romeo and Juliet as Habib and Habiba, and these are done by one person, Muhammad Baba Ahmed. And then you have Merchant of Venice translated as Mazola Ataji, which is like a stingy merchant, kind of, OST, and then 12 Night as 12 Night. So it is only in Ibrahim Yaraya's 12 Night that you have exactly the translation into Hausa. So 12 Night is also 12 Night. But all the others, they kind of adapt it and then change it to some form. And what I'm arguing here that so many of these translations admit that I have tried the best I can to be with the original, but there are places where we don't have the Shakespeare's equivalent in Hausa, or there is just a problem. So I have to paraphrase, so they admit themselves that there are problems with this translation. And sometimes, as many have argued, that translation is not actually an exact copy of the original, but another text. So about that. So I'm just thinking that now we have these kind of different things. What are we doing? Do we ask students to move on to these translations, or do we tell them to stick to the original? And this is why I have this comparative literature as a method that I think we can now use for many reasons. One, we will be able to compare authors that are from different time and from different cultural backgrounds, places, so Shakespeare, and I know this is hugely promising and not easy. Shakespeare, imagine Shakespeare compared to one non-writer, but I think it is possible. And then just as practice of establishing relations. So we try to establish relations, we look for sameness, we look for similarities and all that. And why this is important is because of the influence of Shakespeare. Even the writer I'm studying, Ahmed Rima, you look at the influence of Shakespeare is so visible. Because of course, Nigeria had this history of English colonialism, and so they have been taught Shakespeare as well. So you see it in his writing. And he's also a very ambitious dramatist with over 60 plays and still writing. Even last month, I think, he premiered another play. So we now look at the fame of Shakespeare, somebody who is really famous the world over, and then we try to take this writer that is not known and put them together, and I think that is how this person could also be exported in a way. I'm in Tokyo now, talking about Ahmed Rima. I think we have this process started already. And then it's a way of also inclusion. So we include the marginal, the less studied writers, and we put them with those that have been always at the center. I think it's a way of also decolonizing the process. So what I'm saying is this, just as Saucy says, we should look for common denominator. It is not saying that, we are not saying that we should erase differences. Differences are good, are there, we should always confront them, but that does not mean human experiences are not similar in some ways. So we should look for these similarities. Now, the content of my paper, one, this is, I have said, the most published playwright almost in Nigeria, generally, not only in northern Nigeria, and I said that there are influence of of Shakespeare in his works. Now, one of this is in the tragic characters. Normally, what we have in Shakespeare is that the tragic characters are also title characters. So Macbeth, Hamlet, Julius Caesar, and you see also the same thing when you talk about Ahmed Rima. All the tragic characters also are the title characters in his works. And then also in Shakespeare, we see that tragedy is the preserve of the elite, the people of noble backgrounds, and that is what you find in his works. The tragic plays are mostly about people of royal family. The three plays that I have looked at, they are all from experiences of these people of noble backgrounds. And then there are also plays of historical origins. So just like Shakespeare, where you have plays based on history, you also have plays like Atahiru, which is based on the encounter between the British forces and then one of the emirs who resisted them. So we can just try to experiment this. This is what I'm doing. That instead of giving them the translated, I will say that, okay, we had this. It's a common knowledge that Atahiru fought the British. Yeah, okay. Can we now say that, okay, you look at Shakespeare, similar things happening here, here, here. So we point these common denominators in our own. And also the issue of ghost and spirits are also there. So just like in Hamlet, where you have the king coming, it is similar also. So, and even the relationship is also there. You see, both in Hamlet and this text, Jacadia, you see that the dead are kind of guardians of the living. So they tell the living about what to do and some kind of encrypted knowledge and all that. This is exactly what we see in this text. So also the theme of mistaken identity that we know in Twelfth Night is also prominent in Jacadia and Kadenge, two plays also by Ahmed Rima. So here, mistakes of identity are there, and then they culminate into some kind of tragedy, unlike Twelfth Night. And then prophecy and witchcraft, I think Macbeth. So here, because prior to the arrival of Islam, witchcraft and all these things were there. Then Islam came and then said, okay, so you stop this and all that. But then it didn't actually stop, but it was kind of appropriated by Islam itself. So we have religious scholars, they call themselves religious scholars, who can now do all these things. They tell you about the future and all that. So you have it also in Kalenge, telling the king what would happen, the prophecy kind of like about the succession and all that. So this is what I'm trying to experiment. And why I'm trying to do this is because, one, I believe that it is a way of addressing this coloniality that I talked about. So in a way, I'm putting two texts, giving them equal attention and all that as a possibility. I know it could be challenging, it would be challenging, but I want to see how it would go. And then also, we look at the text from multiple lenses. We look at this here, we look at mistaken identity, witchcraft here, the tragedy itself, and a lot of that. And this will give us more knowledge on literariness, on literary history, on production, literary production and consumption. We will broaden our horizon on all these things instead of sticking to one culture, because we major in English, so we study English authors. And then we put different cultures together through this process. So I just say that we need to foreground differences in the same way that we are also interested in sameness. And then in this way, the essential Shakespeare is preserved. So we know Shakespeare in his own language, and we also use our local resources to understand him better. So this is what I have tried to do. Yeah, this is the end of my presentation, and here is the corpus of my works. So this one, Jakadia, Atahiru, and Kenegia in English, and then Matula Atajiri is one of the translation, and Deren Chaibu is another of the translation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nico, for your presentation. Now, any question from the audience?
It's okay, I can. Just a quick question, are these translations performed? Are they staged where you live?
Some of them, yes. Yeah.
Any other?
Just like this one, the Chaibu was actually written by a professor of Hausa, so he used his students to stage it.
Yeah.
Thank you. So it's such an interesting talk and wonderful to see these comparisons that you're drawing. My question is, so I love what you're doing, but you're using it to sort of question colonial ideas, but is there a danger that you are reinforcing them by using Shakespeare as a sort of prototype, and then by comparison going, oh well, our person also does that, or how do you deal with that complex negotiation?
Yeah, I'm aware of that challenge. That's why in the media draft, I have a paragraph where I had to address this issue that I don't use Shakespeare as a kind of a yardstick. Okay, I'm not using him as a kind of measurement. Okay, so this writer is a playwright because he conforms to Shakespeare and all that. But I'm just trying to say that since we must study Shakespeare, there is an easier way of doing it. Yeah, I'm aware, I'm seriously aware of that. And always, especially this kind of revisionism has this process. If you are not careful, you will produce the same problem that you are trying to address here. Thank you so very much. I should have said it in the talk.
Thank you very much, Sam. That's a very fascinating talk. My question comes from my total ignorance of Nigeria. And you talked about northern Nigeria. And so I asked Sam, maybe it's implicating receptions and so really adaptations and appropriations of Shakespeare in northern Nigeria is different from the southern Nigeria. And then also you talk about the language in Hausa, and then all this language used in southern Nigeria. Are you sort of indicating they are different?
Yeah, thank you for this important question. Actually, I feel there is there is significant difference. Nigeria is one of these mistake of colonialism, where you have different, extremely different people put together, and the same people divided in kind of on pencil, but their realities are still kind of, their perception of their realities and their understanding of it are different. I decided to narrow it down to northern Nigeria because I am seriously unaware of any development towards Shakespeare's translation in other languages, and the languages are just too many. One of the problem of power we have is that we always see the Hausa, the Igbo, and the Yorubas are three major languages, but then it's like belittling the others. So I want to narrow it down to northern Nigeria, and the problem of northern Nigeria is also that Hausa is eating up all these other languages. So I did my PhD on poetry in northern Nigeria, but a lot of the poets I interviewed, some of them will tell me that actually I don't have anything on my own language. It is only the Hausas that have this kind of effort to write. Yeah. So I just want to narrow it down for kind of have some control and contact. Yes.
Thank you very much, Diko. I've got many, many questions, so I'll just try and restrict myself to one. So if I understood, so the first three here were in English and the other two are in Hausa, yeah? I was just wondering, how do the students react to this kind of comparison? And also, how does the department or the faculty, because I know you said part of the reason you're doing it is because you have to do Shakespeare, so let's think about how we can maybe do it in another way, slightly more decolonial way. So how do the students kind of react to having these texts alongside each other, and especially then when they get to the Hausa ones, if they are either Hausa speakers or not Hausa speakers, as you said, what kind of reactions do they have to this approach?
Well, thank you for that. 2 to 3 things I would say here. First, on the issue of on the bureaucratic side, at the department we are expected to teach texts that are written in English. So even these translations are mostly studied in Hausa department, but there are students of English who are of Hausa backgrounds can now read them to kind of get, some of them try just in a way to evade Shakespeare directly, just to have an understanding of what is being talked about. On the other level, the students themselves, some will tell you that the Hausa is another text completely. Not, of course, simpler, but then not as Shakespeare that they have read in the original. And others are also, I have said, trying to evade the difficulty that they think of Shakespeare, then they get the general idea about the text, even if it is not in the language. And then on my colleagues, I would say that I'm still trying to that's why I call it an experiment, to have them agree that this is possible, that we can now, especially for the English ones. And the idea of reproducing coloniality that we talked about is almost there, because in any way it's monolingual. But I'm still saying that despite the fact that it is monolingual, but you have some inclusion. There is some form of inclusion here. I know of a situation where a local writer writing in English was kind of erased or taken out of the prescribed text because they say, no, this is not English enough. So, you know, that's a problem. We really need this consciousness to really decolonize. Yeah. I don't know whether I answered your question.
No, absolutely, yeah.
Okay, thank you so very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So, 2 minutes. Any other question? Okay. It is interesting to hear that English student in English department has a pressure, such a pressure that they should love Shakespeare student. I'm not sure of this in Japan, but I mean, when I studied in England at University of Warwick, even in England, they say Shakespeare is for posh people, not for us. So the question is, how can we deconstruct of Shakespeare again to empower ourselves in our own cultures? Thank you very much. Thank you very much.